Hello, my name is Andrew Brooks. This is another presentation of Non-Linear Existentialism, the title being Wittgenstein's Updated Considerations, a Treatment of Philosophical Investigations. This is the outline. Throughout this entire presentation, what I'm going to do is basically very shortly going over the formulation of belief of Wittgenstein's philosophy, giving what I believe based on my overview of his latter work, a pro-offered interpretation of that work. And then I'm going to do the selected propositions, 32 of them in total, trying to show the body of the arguments I believe he gives in this latter work. And then through that, using the pro-offered interpretation, putting the citations and the two propositions in there to show how I believe the two are related. The propositions lead to certain parts within the pro-offered interpretation. Then we're going to go to Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, his original work, and I'm just going to see if how the two are related, if anything's changed, and the possible answers are going to be those that are going to go in the analysis. And then through this, we can just have any questions if you do. So we'll just So the evolution of Wittgenstein's philosophy, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, was in 1921, and just recently I've done the analysis of that and what I believe are the key points. Then this current work, Philosophical Investigations, 1953, 2 years after his death. And in 1945 was Philosophical Investigations, was kind of the preface to it. And he was in 1945, he basically said he was considering for the last 16 years the thoughts and arguments that he displays in Philosophical Investigations. And based on that, and based on there being such a lag, a time period, the questions I would have is, was there any substantive changes between the two works? If so, how much of an evolution or revolution took place? Did he look at what his original work was and negate his original arguments, or did he take these arguments and say, there's more to consider? And lastly, are the conclusions closer to non-linear existentialism, or do they undermine non-linear existentialism? And whenever you have a philosophy which I've developed, you've always got to test against other philosophers to see if you missed something, if you misunderstood something, if something that they've analyzed and you haven't. So the pro-offered interpretation is the inexact. This is what I'm basing on my reading of his work and what I believe he was saying or meaning to say. The inexact physical process that governs thought and understanding has flexible variable characteristics. Due to such feature, it is possible to produce specific rules, but only after the situation has been considered and experienced and meaning has been properly assigned by those with such experiences. Learning as a language in a linear fashion from a teacher, for example, is the first step in acquiring a means of verbally communicating with others. The second step involves the individual giving internal meaning to the words they have learned, which is sometimes expressed in vague and changeable language. In addition, language without thought is also considered to be possible. So this is what I've gleaned and understood from the analysis of work. And what I'm going to be showing now, I'm just going to go quickly through the quotations a bit. So these are the propositions or statements or remarks that he has in his book. And these are going to be from a translated work. And I have the citation below it, so he has a reference. So where I have proposition 1 would be the first remark statement in his book, and then I have to give it a quotation 1 or quotation 2 up to 32, and it just helps it be a better reference in here. So again, I'm not going to go through each one of them. I had them written out here, transcribed, so the reader can use this and understand what I'm referring to. So again, I'm just going to go through these ones. Language games is a very important part of his contextualizing in his book, one he uses as kind of a primitive language. And then he just gives more information here. He believes learning occurs. And these again are going to be related to the original conclusion that I had, and through them. I'm going to stop here because this is quite interesting that he's defining what game is, and I like that at least he does that, because a lot of times in philosophy, philosophical works, they leave it to the reader to come up with a definition, which lends itself to some vagueness. It's always nice to actually have the author to come out and plainly say it for themselves. So this is quite interesting in saying that a game, which in my mind would imply those rules, saying it's actually not very well regulated and in some ways an unbounded rules, which is quite interesting. Then we also have him talking about game again, blurred edges of a game, whereas with his original work, it seemed like anytime he was talking about logic, there was no blurred. It was very very definite. So with this one, another important quotation, Proposition 85, and let's talk about a signpost. So yes, basically signposts are definite, however, they can be vague. And again, to go into the other quotations, propositions about vagueness of blurredness, which is interesting in this work. Again, inexact, and so that's quite interesting. That is definitely a change. And this one, he actually basically undermines logic. With these considerations, we find ourselves facing the problem: in what way logic, something sublime, sublime meaning supreme, perfect, something to strive towards. So he's somewhat undermining the importance of logic, at least in some ways. 92, he's going in with the idea of there being something. Yes, you can have logical language and they give structure and form and understanding. However, they might give too much structure and form, and there might be something available to the individual, but you have to go deeper, dive deeper. And so I think this is definitely something that's unique, new in his later work, the Philosophical Investigations. So I'm going to go through the rest. And can stop at your leisure to read the quotation. Paraphrase any of these. This one I found interesting because he's saying that if a machine perhaps is developed or made within our form, that perhaps it could think as well. He doesn't just give chase to the idea that only flesh as we have it has the capacity to think, that if something is composed in the same facet or way or as an instrument, yes, it can actually do it, which I find rather refreshing. These are just the rest. Again, there's 32 of them. Please stop at any time to when I give at the end here. And this is going to be the cited interpretation. And it's going to, all these little numbers here are the quotations, not the propositions. And I just found it easier this way, because if I started having them being their actual propositional statement number, it would be somewhat more confusing. So we go to Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, the work that he did much earlier on in 1921. And yes, I will read out the preface, but as I read it out, please keep in mind what some of the quotations, the quotations, prefaces, propositions that I said before. So this is what was from his book at the beginning. Its whole meaning could be summed up, meaning his book, as follows. What can be said at all can be said clearly, and whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. The book will therefore draw a limit to thinking, or rather not to thinking, but the expression of thoughts. For in order to draw a limit to thinking, we should have to be able to think both sides of the limit. We should therefore have to be able to think what cannot be thought. The limit can therefore only be drawn in language, and what lies on the other side of the limit will simply be nonsense, which seems quite a bit different from what I just gave you now with his philosophical investigations, that thought being the driver of language, and if language is allowed to be variable in his new work, changeable, blurred lines, inexact, and such and so forth, then he's directly implying that thinking itself. You can have thinking being very exact, very boundary ridden, and such, and then developing languages is very vague and nimbus. So yes, it is strange. So Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, the three key elements were the triad of logic, language, and thought. In that, logic was sublime, and it basically started off with atomic facts, building on the propositions, and from that nugget of information, that singular fact, atomic fact, as singular as possible, that one could draw out in a perfectly logical structured world environment. Yes, you can lead to the ending. I mean, what the beginning implies directly to the ending. And in language, he kind of pushed off the side, saying very limited, it's the individual's, their world, they're my subjective world. And because of that, because of his vagueness and such and so forth, he wanted to push it aside and said one should only speak to what one is absolutely certain of. And then you got the idea of thought, and then he directly says in Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus that thought is logical. And then in the conclusion of my previous assessment of Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, that I thought there was a contradiction, because how can thought be linear or logical and produce something like language which is not logical? So I thought there was an inherent contradiction. And as before, as again, as I will continue, these are the key aspects of non-linear existentialism. Thought, as defined in separation and integration, proposition T1 within this work, that kind of puts everything forth, and I think in a very discrete fashion for non-linear existentialism. Basically, thought is non-linear. It's through developed incongruencies, leading to interference, leads to instability, and this has been theoretically proposed to be because of V1B in the cerebral cortex. And again, this is just a theoretical construct that I believe exists in the cerebral cortex, but even if that device, that complexion of neurons and such don't exist in that composite, I still believe that the ideas of incongruency, interference, instability actually are very much to the idea of thought, and how it allows us to be able to think the way we do, with the amount of variability, the amount of instability that's necessary for creativity. So also there's frequency modulation that develops thought. It is continuous, which is very important, because Wittgenstein basically says that you can have a person speaking without actually thinking. And through what I'm saying for the FAM, frequency amplitude modulation, that is responsible for the processing of any data within ourselves, any stimuli within ourselves, that is always occurring. So there cannot be nothing produced by the individual without there actually this occurring. So it depends on how you look at it, but because non-linear existentialism is a biologically based form of philosophy, it demands that actually anything that comes out of the individual, like no speech, no language, no nothing, can be apparent or occur without some sort of incongruency, interference, or instability. But of course, as you read the previous works, it is incremental and additive. So purely in the sensory aspect, the lower fundamental processing that does occur, there's very little amount of interference or instability that's added. It's only when it's more and more occurs additive, and then you can actually have the non-linearity. Sorry about that. And so that's one of the big things that I think that is difference between Ludwig Wittgenstein's work and mine, and his latter work in the philosophical investigations is that I don't think in any way is thinking and thought only occur when there's more and more consideration, more and more internal mulling over. It doesn't mean that I don't agree that he could see it in his fashion, but the thing is that from a biological aspect, when you need that binding, and the binding, when you have the temporal binding, can lead to modulation, that you can have anything coming out or being processed in the individual without having this linearity, which is basically different levels of thought. You can have deep thought, and you can have just minor thought. And another key aspect of non-linear existentialism is differential perception and referential knowledge. Differential perception is being able to see, teasing things apart in the environment. And then referential knowledge is when you have that process informations within the individual, be able to compare the two, and then you'll be able to say, you're able to give differences. The thing is, if everything is the exact same that comes in, then nothing can be tall, nothing can be short, nothing can be heavy, can be light. So there has to be ability to have relativity within the individual. The other key aspect for nonlinear existentialism is quantity and quality. Quantity being something that could be measured against, that's an external standard that people in this society are aware of, like a tape measure or time or things like that. And quality is the internal kind of standard that the individual has, their own idea of equality, their own idea of truth and such. And this is something that's not readily seen, not readily observed. And this is when I tease the four apart. I've shown this a number of times. So if you've got a matrix where you've got quantity and quality and differential perception and referential knowledge, you've got these four different overlaps, these kind of permutations. So the interesting ones that I want to bring up is going to be the quantity referential knowledge. And I believe that this is going to be equal to the superficial grammar that is mentioned in one of the quotations, one of the propositions that I've cited in this work. And to me, this is going to be your plain language, the language that you learn. And so it's there, people learn it. I said you've got something to start off with. So it's going to be a quantitative referential knowledge. And then when we get the quality referential knowledge, the internal, then you're going to get something into the depth grammar. And so this is going to be that deeper. So it's going to be giving some of the persons able to, and if you're referring to a non-linear existentialism, be able to decouple from what the language that is commonly shared so people can be able to communicate. That decoupling allows for seeing if there's a deeper understanding, deeper truth, or as Wittgenstein basically mentions, a depth grammar. So possible answers that come through this analysis, going back to those three questions I brought up originally. Was there any substantive changes between these two works? Yes, there certainly was. Number two, if so, how much of an evolution-revolution took place? This is, I'm going to use predictive versus reactive. So logic in his original work, Tractatus, was that yes, if you got those atomic facts and you got prepositions to show how they relate to each other, it's purely predictive. If that's in your structured, pictured world where everything connects, like it's basically the rule book that if you've got to an atomic fact, everything is disclosed, withheld, contained within that, and it tells you everything based on that. And through the 16 years of considering it, I believe it went to an evolution of the idea, not revolution, but we're kind of saying, no, we have the information, we're aware of it, but we only can make the rules and such and so forth after we've actually experienced them. And then through that, we can actually start devising our logic and the rules and how things relate to each other. So he's kind of changed it as such that instead of logic being there and you just know it and either you don't get it, that the logic or understanding or causality, the way of looking at logic, causality can only be understood through actual experience. And also it appears very much so that he's believing that language and such, and the development within the environment is it evolves. It's continue to mutate, grow, and change. The language games he was talking about through interacting with others. So that is, you can argue that's more revolutionary, but I think it's more of an evolution of his original ideas. And then the last one, are the conclusions closer to nonlinear existentialism, or do any of them undermine nonlinear existentialism? This is very interesting. The thing is that when he was talking about thinking, he said, well, you know what thinking is. This is going to be in one of the proposition statements that I've given, that quotations, that what is thinking? Well, you know what thinking is. And that's, to me, is more what you experience. And he's kind of dipping into the sands of the water of psychology here. So that's kind of interesting. A philosopher going into psychology. And in his latter part of this book, the psychological fragments, he starts to talk about behavior being the only real aspect of psychology. But, he's saying, well, he's asking, what thinking is. And as we all know, psychology does not just deal with behavior. It's going to be motives, the way a person thinks and such and so forth, and also self-awareness. So it's interesting he does that, and versus biological, which nonlinear existentialism is based on. And so I think through that it doesn't take away from nonlinear existentialism, but just because I believe firmly that the frequency amplitude modulation occurs all the time, and because that's thinking is deeper thinking. There's thinking and then there's deeper thinking. It occurs all the time because you need that modulation for binding, which can lead to the process, as I've given it, can lead to more and more levels of non-linearity. It doesn't mean just because he's seeing it as in a non-biological way, it doesn't mean that I'm saying he's wrong. He just saw it in a different way. But I don't think that there's anything that he presented that takes away from non-linear existentialism. I believe in many ways his latter work agrees more, it's much more than his original work, where he was being very, not obtuse, but very cut and dry. And as we all know from life and a way of thinking, it is not cut and dry. Anyone who actually thinks purely logical is considered actually very abnormal. And if you think purely logical, you're feeling only new rules and such, you're not going to be very creative and not be able to survive when new things are thrust upon you. So thank you very much for your time on this one. And I would say please take your time and go back over the propositions that I've cited through the quotations, and please see for yourself if my analysis in any way is correct, if it doesn't, my interpretation is not too biased, because anytime you analyze your things with a previous belief and such, you're going to try to bend it towards saying, oh, it agrees with you. Or you're going to take away things. So my concern is that perhaps I've only given citations, propositions, quotations that perhaps favor what I'm talking about with nonlinear existentialism. So again, I'm very grateful for those who review this and ask me questions about this subject in private. So very much, and take care.